There's some comedian somewhere said this, but it's the four seasons of Canada. There's almost winter, winter, still winter, and road construction.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pre-Accident Podcast. I'm your loving host, Todd Conklin. This would be, count 'em, ready, 1, 2, 3, the third time I've had to re-record this introduction. Oh, my goodness. Holy guacamole. So first of all, big thanks to everybody who sent me all the love for my broken computer story. And sorry you had to live through the Disneyland Hotel podcast. I heard I sounded depressed. Okay, so here's what I'm going to tell you. I was not depressed. I was sitting in a hotel room and I had to be quiet. There's a huge difference between depression, which sounds like this, I'm so depressed, and this, I'm talking quietly because I'm at a golf game. I was kind of on the latter of the two. So here's what I'm just going to say this and get it out of the way. For all of you that suffered schadenfreude or whatever that word is, when you were satisfied by my failure, I hope you're happy. Because here's what I'm going to tell you. Man, building resilience into a system totally pays off when the system fails. So my computer just blew up. It went away. It was the blue screen of death plus little words on top of it. It was the worst. I'd never seen anything like it. Like little dotty words were up there. And it just would not recover. It was gone. Fortunately, I had a pretty robust backup system, which you should have if you don't. And I was able to save everything. The power here is in realization that the system will fail. It's not a matter of if it fails. And I'm really careful. I was super careful with this system. I mean, I was so careful I had a dumb backup. That's how careful I was. But it failed. And it failed bigly, to coin a term that's becoming frighteningly common. And when it did fail, I had recovery. And the recovery part of it, I think, is the most interesting part of it. But it was a big lesson for me. And I'm sorry you had to live through the depressing podcast. You lived. I talked about Jeff White's story. And since then, you've heard some really cool stuff. And everything's been going on pretty well. So I think we're going to make it. I think it's going to happen. This is going to be a success. But nonetheless, this is a very cool breeze podcast. You're going to like this one a lot. Because this is Professor James Barker from Dalhousie University in Canada, Nova Scotia to be specific. You know that he's a complexity guy, organizational complexity dude. He's going to talk about risk and complexity. And he's going to talk about risk and complexity. He's going to talk about it through a really interesting lens, a teaching lens. He's going to talk about BlackJack and risk. Now, I don't know how much you know about BlackJack. It's going to be really clear when you hear this podcast. I don't know very much. I'm not a gambler. I do pretty well in Vegas at the buffet table. But the actual gambling tables, I don't really go to because I don't know. It's just not my deal. And you're going to find that because he's going to ask me questions about BlackJack that a better person should have probably known, but I do not know. He's going to talk about this in a very cool way. Maybe the best thing to do is for me to just kind of shut up and let you enjoy Jim Barker, Risk and Complexity on the Pre-Accident Podcast.
Talk about in this podcast, I want to talk about how we experience risk. And what motivated me to talk about this one is a comment, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, but it's a comment that you make about how we're as safe as we need to be productive. And so if we start thinking about that, well, what does that mean in reality? How do we gauge risk in a way where we can be as safe as we need to be and still be productive? And how does that fit then with us being in complex organizations and probabilistic environments? So here's where I landed on that thinking, Todd. And I'm taking something I want to talk about today and how we experience risk. I want to talk about that using an exercise that I do in my executive education classes. And what we do in the class is we play the card game 21, or also called BlackJack. You're familiar with that game, Todd?
I am. I'm terrible at it, but I'm very familiar with it.
Well, let's talk about it just a bit. The concept of the game is you play against a dealer or the house. and other players can play, but you're not competing among the other players as such. You're always competing with the house. So more than one person can win in any given time. But if you know the game really well, who do the odds always favor, Todd?
I believe the only answer to that would be the house.
Yeah, they do.
I'm pretty certain they don't build giant fancy casinos based upon losing money.
Yeah, no, they sure don't. So everything favors house, and you know that going in. Into the game, you know that the odds will favor the house, but you know that you have to play your hands accordingly. So, 21 is a very, very complex game. Although it looks very simple on the surface, the actual intricacies of it are quite complex. And they fit the elements that when we talk about complexity, when we think about complexity. For you and the other players, and even the person who's the dealer, you're all interdependent. The choices that you make among cards, how much money you bet, all of those have interdependencies with each other. The flow of the game has interdependencies to it, because if someone's sitting on your left, if you think about playing around a big table, and this is how it usually works in the casinos, you're playing around a big table. And the person on your left will get cards first. So their choice will actually dictate the cards that you get, even though you don't know what those cards are. We're also interconnected together in the flow of the game. Again, there's a certain order that things happen. There's a certain flow to the game, and we're all aware of the flow to the game. And everyone's very interrelated. Everybody wants to win, and more than one person can if you have multiple people playing with the game. But the odds, again, favor the house. But the interesting thing about the idea about being interrelated, that what we're trying to do in that we're all trying to win, and some of us can win, but actually what we're trying to do is just to increase the odds that we have, increase the odds of winning, of getting the hand that we want. Even somebody who's card counting, card counting doesn't guarantee that you'll win. Card counting only helps you increase the odds that you will win. But the last part, besides being interdependent, interconnected, interrelated, is that there's infinite potentialities. So in any hand, there's really an infinite way that it can play out. It all depends on how many players are there, the peculiarities of the individual players. Players come and go in the flow of the game. Players hold hit cards. Some do it deliberately. Some really don't know what they're doing in the flow of the game. Maybe that the game's flowing real well and cards are moving in your favor, and you haven't gone to the bathroom for a while, and you really got to go. And so you get up and go, and that changes the whole potentiality of things that are happening within the game. The game also gets played around certain thresholds and constraints, just like in an organization. These thresholds and constraints that are there also affect the flow of the game. The game's very rule-bound, just like an organization, just like especially a risk organization with safety. It has certain rules to it, and those rules dictate how the game is played and how it flows, even though it still has those infinite potentialities. Everyone abides by the rule, even particularly about the house. There are certain rules as when the house or the dealer has to take hold with the hand that they set. Do you know what? Let me ask you something else about that flow of the game, Todd. Do you know what the importance of the number 17 is?
Isn't that where
in playing blackjack?
Isn't 17 where the house must hold?
Yes. So if I'm the dealer and I get a 17, let's say I get a 10 and a 7, and so you in simple rules in 21, you just add up the number of the cards. Face cards count as 10, and an ace can count as either 1 or 11. So let's say I'm the dealer and I have a 10 and I have a 7. I have a total of 17. I have to stand there. I can't take any more cards. So if your two cards that you start out with, say that your two cards are a 10 and a 2, what are you going to do? If I'm holding a 17, what are you going to do if you've got a 10 and a 2?
I'm going to take a hit.
Yeah, because you got 12. You're not going to win anyway. You have to take a hit.
Yeah.
So, but there's risk in that. There's always risk at play because you've got a bet on the table. Let's say, you got $10 bet. You've got right now, because as you started, you're for sure going to lose that $10. So you might as well take a hit. You'll have nothing to lose. So let's say you get an 8. What happens? You've got a 10, a 2, and you draw an 8. You got 20.
I just won.
What happens?
I won. I'm the big winner.
Yeah, you won because I can't do anything about it. as the house. That's the idea about 17. So now how did it play out? Let's say now that I'm holding as a dealer, I'm holding a 10 and a 6, but you're also holding the 10 and the 2. So I'm under 17. So what do I have to? I've got a total of 16. You've got a total of 12. What should I do?
Right. So
I'm sorry. What should you do? I'm sorry. What should you do?
So I am going to. Well, so I have 12. So probably I'll say hit me, and the dealer will say hit me, and I'll hope the dealer will bust.
Well, why would you do that? I mean, why? I've got to take a card at 16 as a dealer. I have to. So why would you take a card?
Because what if I got an ace or something good, or a 7 or something?
Well, but the odds are better though that I will be as a house. I'll be the one to go bust.
Didn't I start this by telling you I was terrible at this?
But you see how it plays out. If the way that 17 works in the playing of the game, if you're the dealer, you have to hold at 17. You can't take any more cards. But if you have anything under 17, you have to draw a card. So if I've got 16, I have to draw a card. Certainly, I might draw a 3 and get a 19, have a much better hand. But the odds are, at that point, I'm going to lose. That I'm going to draw something higher than a 5 and go bust. But that's what if you've got the 12. So the best thing for you to do at the 12 is just to stay. Because if you draw another face card, another 10, there's lots of face cards in a deck.
Right.
Then you go bust.
I'm writing all this down. I'm getting better even as we speak.
But that's how the game flows, and the game and that's the basic rules of the game. But everyone that's playing, particularly if you're an expert player, you understand that. Now there's lots of other kinds of variations, and I don't want to get into those because they it just adds a bit more level of intricacy. But it's basic if we just keep things on the simple level. But everything tends to revolve around that number 17. And so if you get a 17, you've got a pretty good hand. And that's where you want to be, whether you're the house or the dealer or whether you're a player. That's what you want. You want to get a 17 because 17 is a pivotal number. And in terms of how the game is played. But notice what will tend to happen though as you're playing the game, and this is what I like about it, and why I think it's important to understand about risk and increasing the probability that we will be successful. You need to know those basic rules of the game to increase your probability to be successful. So then what you do when you know those rules and you watch the game flow, and what you try to do then is to move with the flow of the game. That's what I mean. If you see the dealer get a 16, well, for sure you're going to make the dealer draw. Yeah, like I say, if you're holding a 13, 14, 15, that kind of thing. You know that if the dealer's holding a 17, 18, or 19, you're holding a 12, 13, 14, you've got to draw. Even though there's lots of risk in there, you've got to take that risk. Now think about this, Todd, particularly as we think about organizations that deal a lot with safety. That's how we start thinking. We start in our head. We start making these kinds of adaptations. We start seeing how the game is unfolding in front of us. We basically understand the rules, but we also understand risk. And we also understand when we need to take a hit and take a chance, take a risk, and when we don't. And that's how we play out. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't. But that brings us back, though, to that importance of the number 17. If 17 in BlackJack represents the 70% solution that we talk a lot about in safety, Todd. Why do we try to do in a complex organization? We try to get to that 70% solution because that puts us in a pretty good space. Yeah, we're going to hit that 3 out of 10 sometimes. And sometimes there's going to be real anomalous events that occur. But for the most part, what we try to do is adapt so that we can hit that 70% solution. That's what the number 17 represents in BlackJack, or 21. You get to 17, you've gotten in a pretty good place. So in our organizations, Todd, what we try to do in our organizations, we try to adapt. And remember, in adaptation and complexity, it's to adapt fittingly. It means if you adapt, you're increasing the probability of getting the outcome that you want. And so that's how we handle risk, whether it's financial risk, whether it's risk to the image of the organization, whether it's risk to our productivity, whether it's safety, we gauge risk, and what we try to do is to get to that 70% solution. We try to deal ourselves a 17. That's how we navigate this sense of complexity in day-to-day life, Todd. That's how we try to adapt so that we can be as safe as we need to be and still be productive.
So when you're in a system that's interdependent, interconnected, infinite possibilities, constrained and rule bound, you really are constantly managing you're sort of betting the odds. You're managing the outcome to that 70% solution. That's
what you're trying to do. That's really what adaptation is. That you're trying to get to that. You're trying to keep adapting so that you're still in that 70% space. There are lots of times that we like to think that that we can get it perfect, that we can like to think that we get it higher from that. But the complex reality is that we have to adapt, that the environment keeps changing, and we have to keep trying to do what we can do to keep in that 70% range. Here's a good example, Todd. Again, let's go back and let's re-envision the blackjack game that's played. If you've been to a casino before, blackjack's usually played at a big table. It can have 4, 5, 6 people at the table at any one time. Dealer also deals to the person who is to the left of the table if you're sitting at the table, or the dealer's right if you envision the dealer standing there. And then it proceeds from right to left around. So if you're an experienced player and somebody and say there's an open chair to your left, and a very novice player comes and sits there, someone who really doesn't understand how to play the game very well, but they're going to get cards before you do. And so they may be making relatively poor choices in terms of how to take cards. But what that does, though, that affects your game, because now that there's a novice player there. You know that they may not necessarily follow some of the nuanced ways of playing the game, which means they may take cards that you should be getting. And so it affects your calculations, your sense of risk in the moment, and how you work with that risk. But we adapt to that. The best thing that can happen in that situation is for that novice player to get trained up as quickly as that person can, so that they play more by the general flow of safety and the general flows of the rule. Now, take that example out of blackjack and put it into an organization. Think about the person that's out on the oil rig, out in the ocean, for example, trying to learn each time that they go up and down the stairs, they have to take one hand and hold on to the rail. That takes a little bit of learning to get ingrained in a person. And out on the oil rigs, they have methods in place to help people remember to do that. But once that person remembers and they learn how to play correctly, then it improves everybody's chance of having a successful outcome.
This is really interesting. Well, there's a couple things that come to mind. One is the moral imperative to be beyond that 70% is going to cause a little bit of a heartache in the podcasting community, because I think people truly believe that 70% is not good enough. And yet you're telling me in complex systems, 70% is pretty much what we manage to. And it's reliable enough that, for instance, casinos can run by it. Fair enough?
Right. Yes. Because, but let's go and let's talk about the casinos, or let's talk about the house. What kinds of things will they do? Well, they'll train the dealers very well. Excuse me. And you can find continually ways of training the dealers. They change out card decks quite often. They have surveillance cameras all over the place. But now those things will not guarantee a perfect outcome. Somebody's still going to win big. What it tries to do, it tries to keep things operating within the standard ways. It keeps them at that 70% solution for it.
Well,
they won't win every hand. They won't win every time. They won't stop every cheater.
Right, but one way
in a good space.
One way I think they do manage that 70% towards their favor is by giving out free alcohol. Don't you think that makes a difference?
Well, it does. Again, there's one of the things in the flow and the effect of the game. What if you're, the experienced player and you're staying relatively sober, but again, the person sitting on either side of you, but probably it's more important if they're sitting to the left of you because they get the cards first. They're getting inebriated and they start to make poor choices.
So
think about that to the organization.
So are the
somebody who's sick, let's say, on a day.
Are the odds in blackjack better if you sit in the first left seat?
Well, you just get cards first. But the choices that you make affect everybody else. It's not necessarily better because there's the inherent randomness to the cards.
Right.
What it means, though, is that your choices affect the people that sit, that will get cards after you.
Wow. So what do we do with this? This is remarkable. This is a whole different way to think about risk, or it's a much more not interesting. What's the word I want? It's a very, very, it requires much intellectual engagement to start thinking about blackjack and risk operationally. That's cool.
Well, and again, remember, I used this in my executive education class. I'm using this with more senior managers, that have dealt with issues for a while, and they can understand the reality of it because they've been in situations where they have to make these kinds of choices to be as safe as they need to be and still be productive, but also bear the responsibility for high risk systems. But there's a couple of things I want to talk about. First, let's take the issue of 70% isn't good enough and that moral imperative around it, especially when the risk that we're talking about is human life. That's a very difficult issue to take on with and to be satisfied with. And to an extent, we shouldn't be satisfied with it. What we have to realize, though, is in a complex organization, that is a reality. And we can do everything that we can do to try to increase the probability of success. But we will always be chasing a number when we will not get that success. We will always be chasing a number that will result in an accident. That will happen. It's out there. And the record, particularly if you look at things like aviation, where so many things are done to enhance safety, accidents still happen. They will happen. So we can try it. And here's what the moral imperative is, Todd. The moral imperative is to adapt fittingly. The moral imperative is to keep trying to get better. We can't get to perfection, and deep down inside we know that. But what we can do is we can adapt. We can move. We can see consequences happening. When we see those consequences, we make changes. Just like in the casino. If in the surveillance system you see people counting cards in what must be a new way, you see that happening, you explore it, and you figure out how to mitigate that. That's the kinds of things you do. If you're a pit boss, and pit boss is a general manager that controls, probably 6 or 7 dealers in a casino. If you're the pit boss and you see a dealer struggling, you arrange extra training for that person, just like in the organization. If you see somebody who's not holding on the handrail when they go up and down the stairs on the oil rig, you do something about that. You get additional training for it. That's what the moral imperative is. The moral imperative is to see the consequences out there that are moving us away from safety. They're moving us toward the likelihood of an accident, and we deal with those. I'll just ask one more thing with you, Tanya. What's the purpose of a pre-accident investigation? Well, the purpose of a pre-accident investigation, to take your book, the whole purpose of that is to increase the likelihood of a good outcome. You're trying to anticipate consequences, trying to mitigate those. Am I right on that one?
Yeah. You're looking for conditions that exist within the organization that could indicate really operational conflict, and solving those conditions before the conflict appears. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I realize this moral imperative to get to a 90%, 100% solution. And I realize that, and I appreciate that. The problem with it is that it's so powerful, and it's very, very powerful. It's very powerful and very, very important, because if you're in a high risk organization, when you have an accident, people are hurt and lives change. But what the moral imperative again really is to keep adapting, to keep sensing consequences, to understand when we start to move in a bad direction and we do something about that. That's what that's what we have to grasp with that moral imperative. We take that moral imperative and we start to see better, though, why we make these choices that we make to be as productive as we need to be and still be successful. To be as safe as we need to be and still be productive.
Yeah.
Said that wrong. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but I'm with you. Or it flips around the other way. You're as productive as you need to be in order to be safe. I mean, it's all kind of the same relationship. So where's this take us? What's the nugget of wisdom that we carry out of this discussion? Other than I'm going to have to think on this a while. That's for sure.
Well, if what I would like to take from this is this idea of us thinking deeply and differently about the notion of how it is that we're as safe as we need to be to still be productive. And if we dig into that, what we discover is how we are managing risk in real time. That's one of the most revealing things about exploring the game of blackjack and how it's played. It gives us a sense for how we manage risk in real time. And that's what we're doing.
And a good blackjack player isn't risk adverse. A good blackjack player is probably risk effective. They probably play the game because they're attracted to the risk part, and what they try to manage is that level of risk. Fair enough?
That's right. But that's what you do. That's how you play the game successfully.
You realize, of course, that's a 180-degree turn in what we've traditionally used to attract good workers. I think we've traditionally looked for workers who are risk adverse, not risk attracting.
But it again, this is it is a difficult point to accept, but what can we take away from it? Like you said before, let's go back to that. While you in line with what you're talking about with people who are risk effective and understand risk, that's what we have to do. We have too often, Todd, we train ourselves to think that risk, that risk can go away, that we can manage it. We can't do that. Risk is always going to be there. Risk is present whether we're in a high-risk industry that deals with human lives or whether we're in just a simple retail industry. Risk is always there. Again, it may be financial risk, productivity risk. The value that the organization creates is always at risk. That's just how it is in a complex organization. Markets change, new competitors enter, snowstorms occur, and you don't get sales on a particular day. So risk is always there. So what we do as human beings, moment by moment, we are dealing with that risk in the organization. And so what the game of blackjack does as we look into it, it reveals a sense for how we as human beings play that, or how we navigate risk in real time. But particularly, Todd, it calls our attention to adaptation. Because we talk about, and we're very easy to talk about this in when we talk about complexity. We'll say, well, what you have to do is adapt, but we don't really talk about what that means. What does it mean to adjust fittingly? And that's where our learning is. When we look at a particular workflow or a particular industry or a particular work group, what does it mean to adapt fittingly? What do we need to do? What consequences do we need to sense? How can we tell when we've started to move in a bad direction? Like drift, again, to go back to the work of Sidney Dekker and bring the concept of drift in. That's what we have to spot. We have to spot those kinds of things.
So what do you think? Pretty cool podcast, I thought. The whole notion of interdependence, interconnectedness, interrelatedness, and infinite possibilities, which are sort of the basic premises around complexity anyway, those are really interesting when you think about blackjack and where you sit on the table and how the person to the left of you has the ability to influence that. I love how Jim always gets back around to the notion of adapting fittingly, adjusting fittingly, because that really is the discussion we have around this notion of adaptation. And that's a pretty cool way to look at the world, that's for sure. That's the podcast for today. What'd you think? Pretty cool, huh? Hey, if you've got feedback for me, somebody you want to get on, Steve McElhaney said he wants to talk a little bit about fatigue, and I think fatigue's probably a pretty good topic. So let's look to see if we can bring something together on that. I'm going to call my buddy at NIOSH and see if I can get some stuff out of him. I think that'd be a pretty good interview for sure. Other than that, life is grand. We're back in business. The podcast is up and running. What more could I ask for? Well, I know I could ask for a couple more things. One is I hope you get everything you need. Have as much fun as you possibly can. Learn something new every single day. And for goodness sakes, be safe. Okay, near as I can tell, you're supposed to stick at 17. So hit at 16, stick at 17. Keep saying that. Hit at 16, stick at 17. Hit at 16, stick at 17.